This video will contain spoilers for Neon Genesis Evangelion, End of Evangelion, the Rebuild films 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. I will also reference parts from 3.0 plus 1.0 Thrice Upon a Time, but only minor spoilers, and of course, Code Geass. You have been warned. I first watched Neon Genesis Evangelion 7 years ago, back in 2014. The only copy that my local library had was a version containing multiple DVD cases, so naturally I was swapping out cases like a madman during my quest to finish this anime. It's been a while, but I don't remember enjoying the overall series, but still appreciate it for what it was, including the ending. 5 years later, I wanted to experience Evangelion without rewatching the series from beginning to end, so I watched Death and Rebirth and End of Evangelion, and just like the original, I had no idea what happened at the end, but enjoyed the ride, I suppose. The film contained impressive visuals, and Asuka's death continues to be a scene that has stuck with me ever since watching the film. This year, I watched Neon Genesis Evangelion for the second time. After doing so, I gained an appreciation for this series, as it's now extremely obvious how it impacted the genre, and if it weren't for Neon Genesis Evangelion, we wouldn't have Code Geass. Since my first watch of End of Evangelion back in 2019, I was aware of the Rebuild films, but had no real interest in watching them, much like the Code Geass recap films. And much like those movies, my only motivation to experience the Evangelion Rebuild films was the release of the final film in the series, Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0 Thrice Upon a Time. Despite going into these films with the desire to enjoy them, I walked away with the opposite reaction. I hated these films as a whole and regretted watching them. This doesn't even include the latest film, which didn't help matters. There were parts during the second film and definitely during the third where I had to check myself out because I had no desire to continue watching. After forcing myself to finish these films twice, I unleashed my rage in a rant that I did in my latest live stream. Since then, I've calmed down a bit, watched some interesting videos discussing the films, and did some more research. The results? Well, I still don't like these films, but can appreciate some of the nuances surrounding them, especially the meta-story elements. What I'm going to attempt to do in this video is to first discuss some tidbits about the films themselves, second, briefly discuss the pros and cons of each, and third and finally discuss how and why the Code Geass films succeeded where the rebuilds failed. Also, special thanks to Ava Monkey and Blue Nova, two channels that I have never directly contacted, but whose videos on Evangelion helped improve my understanding of the series. I will link to their videos in the description below. Definitely check them out if you have any question on the series, as they are both very underrated channels. We need to start off this discussion with an important question. Why do these films exist? Here's the answers I found online. Answer number 1. Anno wanted to create a new version of Evangelion that would be more accessible for the fans. Answer number 2. Anno wanted to correct the mistakes of the original series while telling a similar but ultimately different story. The idea was to create several films that would lead to a promise of a brand new ending. Answer number 3. Anno wanted to use money from the films to create Studio Kara, which he planned on using to help guide anime to the next stage, since he felt the medium was dying. By the way, through his actions we got Yuri on Ice and SSD Gridman. And answer number 4, which is the most obvious.
He needs money! He always needs money!
For this video, I'm only focusing on the first two answers. Number 3 is very noble, but ultimately irrelevant when discussing the quality of the films, and number 4 is self-evident. The Evangelion films as a whole have some weird elements that I simply must mention. There are two dubs, the Prime Video dub and the Funimation dub. Despite the consensus among fans who happen to enjoy the Funimation one more, I enjoyed the Prime Video dub way more. Also, there are two versions of these films, a 0.0 and a whatever the film we're on. So 1.0 and 1.11 for example. The main differences seem to be extra and bright scenes. I find it amusing that of course there would be multiple versions of these films. It seems very apropos for Evangelion. So that's a brief explanation for why the films exist. Let's move on now to the critique of each one. As a whole, these films were difficult to get through for several reasons. Reason 1, too much CGI. Reason 2, more blatant distracting fan service, mostly of minors. Reason 3, the plot is even more confusing than before. Reason 4, the lore is conveniently retconned. Reason 5, the films aren't as fun when compared to the original series. Reason 6, the characters lack depth and development. Reason 7, the film's lack of focus. And you will see what I mean when discussing each film individually. Before doing that though, I want to mention the fans' perspective on these films that are relevant to this discussion. Number 1, fans seem to be split on these films, with some enjoying either the first two or the last two. Since Untitled changed directions after the March 11, 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, this split makes sense because the films seem like two different stories. Number 2. The common defense for these films is that the meta story is what matters here and not the actual story itself. The film is meant to represent Anno's struggle with depression and how he recovered from it. I know it's way more than that, but that's my simple understanding of it. This defense seems more like an excuse than a valid point. Metaphors and symbolism are like CGI. They enhance the film, but they are not substitutes for the film itself. With full control, there's no reason why Anno could not create a film strong in both areas. I don't watch Evangelion for a fun, silly adventure with a deep message. That's what Gurren Lagann is for. What's wrong with taking Evangelion seriously and expecting an intellectually stimulating story? That's a macro view of the films. Let's now proceed to film 1, Evangelion 1.0, You Are Not Alone. Of the 3 films that I will be discussing, this one was my favorite and the easiest to understand. If you're keeping score at home, it closely follows episode 1 through episode 6 from Neon Genesis Evangelion, which made it easier to digest. That's not to say that it didn't change things, it did, but not to the same extent as the other films. I like the new animation treatment, especially the scenes where Shinji defeats the 6th angel. My only complaints are the removal of Shinji blocking the rubble with Yuno-1's hand before entering it at the start of the film, and the new version of Rei's changing scene. Why did Anno do this? I will never understand. The same complaint also applies to seeing Rei's nipples in that awkward apartment scene. Other than that, it was a great film, an easy 9 out of 10. Evangelion 2.0 You Could Not Advance covers episode 8 to I guess episode 19 or 24 of Neon Genesis Evangelion. I guess it depends on your understanding of the story. It adds a new character named Mari, who is the 4th child, and changed several parts from the original anime. For example, Asuka pilots Unit 3 instead of Toji, they removed Israfel, and the biggest is how the film ends. In the original anime, it ends with Unit 1 awakening, going berserk, and consuming Zuriel, aka the 10th angel, and in the film it ends with Shinji saving Rei from the 10th angel, which starts the 3rd impact. It's thanks to Karu that it stopped. So, what I like about this one, the entire trip to the research aquarium tasked with restoring the ocean's ecosystem was a nice break in the film's action. It's one of the only times we see these children acting like children in these films. There's even a good part of foreshadowing Rei's identity. Speaking of Rei, I enjoyed the side plot of Rei learning to cook to help unite Shinji and his father during that party they were supposed to have. It was nice that they gave Rei stuff to do and did a great job humanizing her. Her sacrifice during the battle against the 10th angel was very emotionally impactful, and I'm glad they kept that from the original anime. I didn't mind how they introduced Asuka in the film, and her line of "It's been a while, Misato," hits different when you take into account how long it's been since the original anime. Although I will say I did like the boat scene from episode 9 way more though. The action, although confusing at times, was still awesome, especially the fight against the 10th angel. Putting Asuka in Unit 3 didn't bother me, and that scene is still horrifying as it ever was. Oh, and the music in this film was epic. It reminded me of Bleach and matched the biblical elements perfectly. I'm thankful that they kept that infamous elevator scene. Okay, let's move on now to what I didn't like. Number 1, Asuka's character development is non-existent outside of rushed throwaway lines, including her conversation with Misato. Number 2, Asuka living with Shinji makes no sense and was only done to mirror the original anime. In the original anime, Shinji and Asuka failed to defeat Israfel, which is why Misato had them live together to improve their sync rate. The films don't have Israfel, so instead Misato decided to do this because they needed to learn to work together. If that was the case, why not have Rei live with them as well, since Asuka has issues with her? It just seemed they wanted to create the moments from the original anime without realizing why they existed in the first place. Number 3, Beast Mode and everything associated with it. Number 4, Unit Zero's color is no longer blue. They kept the ugly orange. This is annoying because the blue color matched Rei's personality. I thought the creators made each of the Ava's color match their pilot's personality. I guess I was wrong. Number 5, Mari and everything about this character. Yes, I understand why she exists, but they could have came up with better ideas to prevent Anno from retelling the same story. For example, in the film itself, Asuka pilots Unit 3 instead of Toji. I disliked Mari's character for several reasons, and before you ask, I am taking all films into account with these complaints. She is sexualized way too much for me to take her seriously. Her attitude came across as annoying. She takes away from the other characters in this already bloated film. She ruins the tone in this film, making things more lighthearted when they shouldn't be. Every time she's on screen, it just takes you out of the film. It's almost like she forgot this was the wrong anime, but refuses to leave and just goes along with it. And finally, ultimately her role in this story was pointless, and the payoff for her character was disappointing. Back to more complaints. Number 6, this film had even more bad CGI. Number 7, the explanations for the the events happening in the background were not enough to fully understand what was going on. Number 8, Kaji and Misato's relationship is not explored in a satisfactory manner. This is especially disappointing when you consider the events in 3.0 plus 1.0 Thrice Upon a Time. Overall, I give the film a 7 out of 10. I was able to follow the plot. It had some awesome action sequences, but what drags it down are the poor choices in how they decide to change the story in differentiating this film from the original anime. Let's move on to film 3, Evangelion 3.0 You Cannot Redo. This film takes place 14 years after the events of You Cannot Advance. I assumed they did this so Reikyu could catch up in age to Shinji and Asuka, since the other Rei is trapped in Unit 1. The opening action scene was jarring and just seemed like a compilation of just CGI all over the place. I had to do serious research to answer the who, what, where, and so on concerning what happened in this scene. Here's a quick list of all the important things you need to know about this film. There's an organization called Ville, which was formed by Misato to prevent NERV from starting the future impacts. They are essentially at war with each other. NERV interferes with their plan to capture Shinji when Reikyu captures Shinji and brings him back to our remains of NERV's headquarters. At NERV's headquarters, Gendo tells Shinji that he and Karu will pilot Unit 13 to start the fourth impact. There's also this device introduced called the DSS Choker, which will kill a pilot if the Eva starts to awaken. Karu prevents the fourth impact by sacrificing himself, and it's also thanks to Mari that Zele doesn't use Shinji instead. Eventually, Asuka finds Shinji and his Eva, and Reikyu joins them. The film ends with the three of them walking away. That was a very quick summary, and I definitely missed some points, but there's a reason for that, and that's because I didn't enjoy this film, nor did I really understand half of it anyways. When it comes down to it, I only have 5 positive things to say about this film. Number 1, it ended. Number 2, the entire time when Shinji is with Karu was excellent, especially when they play piano or during the reveal of what happened during the third impact. Number 3, the battle in Terminal Dogma where Shinji and Unit 13 battled Asuka in Unit 2 and Mari and Unit 8 was awesome. Number 4, despite it being all over the place, I enjoyed the entire part of Shinji removing the spears and the start of the fourth impact. And number 5, I like the overall message that you cannot undo the sins of your past, but instead must move forward, something that other animes have taught me as well. A message that becomes increasingly more important the older I get. With only 5 positive things to say about this movie, you can imagine there's a lot I didn't like. Let's go over those parts. Number 1, the opening part is confusing, as I mentioned before, too much CGI. Number 2, despite it being 14 years in the future, besides everyone looking as if they are 14 years older, none of the characters outside of Mai have changed much, which is surprising because again, it was 14 years. Number 3, as I record this video, it's not clear what happened between the two films, which makes this whole experience that more confusing. Number 4, some of the Eva action in this film felt silly and out of place. Number 5, how the Wonder works seems contradictory to the series lore. If you turn your brain off, it's very aesthetically pleasing. Number 6, Ville annoyed me so much in this film that I was hoping for their deaths at the end, which unfortunately didn't happen. It was mostly due to my distaste for the new characters. Number 7, the Eva curse is a cheap plot device that's not fully explored and adds more problems than it solves. And I'm aware of the meta reasons for it, but I don't care and it's still stupid. Number 8, the fan service is rampant in this film, and with that, I want to go on a small tangent / rant because this is one area of all the films that really pissed me off. I have a question. Why do these films go out of their way to add more fan service scenes involving minors? When it came to Neon Genesis Evangelion, they had nudity, but they removed the nipples, and most of the time it was during the trippy dreamlike sequences. 3.0 and 2.0 added more fan service during both the slice of life and combat scenes, which were very distracting. And yes, I know there's a meta reason for this, but I don't care. It doesn't justify this crap. I have to seriously wonder what was Anno thinking when creating these films. Did no one else find it odd that they were adding more fan service on minors in these films? Looking at the story as a whole, if they had just removed those scenes, they could have added more moments to develop the plot or characters, which was seriously needed. I only tolerated this during the films because Neon Genesis Evangelion had similar elements, so in a sick way, I was used to it already. But if this was my first time experiencing this, I would have dropped these films after film 2. How was this more accessible for the fans again? Don't answer that. I don't want to know. Number 9, and this is the last one and a general complaint which could apply to the series as a whole, but is mostly relevant here. Things in general are not clear and required significant research to make any sense of it. In my case, I needed to read several Wikipedia articles and watch many YouTube videos. It was extremely irritating that there weren't answers to my questions, or other people's for that matter. I never enjoy watching films which make me feel like a moron after it ends, because I didn't get what happened. As of right now, I have a much better understanding thanks to hours of research, but the fact that I had to do all that and technically still walk away without a complete picture is very telling. This film really turned me off from the series almost in the same way as The Last Jedi did. However, unlike The Last Jedi, I did watch 3.0 plus 1.0 thrice upon a time, and I will discuss that in a later video. Okay, so now that I've discussed my thoughts on the films, let's jump into the final topic of why the Code Geass films, unlike the rebuild films, were better and succeeded in their goals. So for those who don't know, between 2017 to 2018, Sunrise produced 3 films that recap the original series Code Geass, Luch of the Rebellion R1 and R2 with some changes to the plot. The names of the films are Initiation, Transgression, and Glorification. The biggest changes involved Shirley's fate and everything associated with it. By the way, I have so many videos discussing the Code Geass alternate universe if you're interested. I couldn't find a source for this, but it's most likely the case that Sunrise made these films for similar reasons as the rebuild stories. It is reasonable to argue that Sunrise copied the idea. I know for sure they were designed to set up the 4th film and the actual sequel of the series, Lelouch of the Resurrection. Beyond that, I speculate they also made these films to create a simpler version of the original anime to make it more accessible to the fans, which for the most part the films succeed in. That's why the Code Geass films are better in this respect. You don't require any prior knowledge of Code Geass to watch them, whereas the rebuild films do. The Code Geass films are not perfect by any means and suffer from pacing issues among other problems, but here's the thing, if you've never seen the original series and just watched the films, you might not notice any of these issues to begin with. That's because the films focused on keeping the core of the story the same while only making small changes. The rebuild films relied on your prior knowledge, especially since according to some, the films are connected to the original series, a topic for another time. But it's not just the over-reliance of the original source material. As I mentioned earlier, the Code Geass films did a better job of creating a simpler version of the original source material. The Code Geass recap films removed most of the fluff from the original series, including the fan service and the slice of life scenes. In contrast, the Evangelion rebuild films doubled down on aspects like those. The Code Geass films simplified many of the confusing plot points besides the Ragnarok connection. It even addressed several plot holes which make the story easier to understand. The rebuild films add even more things that overly complicate an already complicated story. Code Geass had better endings and opening scenes to its films which set up the events to come. I could go on, but you get the idea. But the question is then, why does this matter? Well, let's go back to what I said at the beginning. Why do they make these films? The first reason was Anno wanted to create a new version of Evangelion that would be more accessible to the fans. The second reason was Anno wanted to correct the mistakes of the original series while telling a similar but ultimately different story. But when you look at these reasons, did Anno actually succeed? The simple answer is no. The films are more confusing than the original anime, and instead of correcting mistakes, it just makes more blunders along the way. This might surprise you after what I just said, but I would have liked it better if the Code Geass films had gone the Evangelion route and changed more elements of the story. And I wish the Evangelion films followed what Code Geass did in retelling the same story with smaller changes. If you want an example, we can use Asuka piloting Unit 3 over Toji. Anno half-assed it when it came to making these films, and as you know,
never half-ass 2 things. Whole-ass 1 thing.
He wanted to make the films a way for new fans to enjoy the Evangelion story, but he also wanted to make something completely different from the original story. If you think about it, those are completely opposite goals that Anno could have accomplished in 2 separate projects. The first project could have been a brand new Evangelion story, and the second could have been a retelling of the original, like the Code Geass recap films. The retelling could have small changes, and they could remake episodes 25, 26, and End of Evangelion. Combine these 2 separate goals into one clearly backfired, ruining what could have been an Evangelion experience that everyone was supposed to enjoy. With that, we have come to the end. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the rebuild films and the Code Geass alternative universe recap films. Which approach do you think was better? By the way, this was a simple discussion on the films, and there is so much more I'd like to talk about in the future if you guys would be interested. Some ideas included maybe doing a video discussing the difference between the films and the original series, including End of Evangelion. I could also go through each film individually individually and do a more of a thorough analysis. Whatever you guys would be interested in, just let me know. Also, just remember that these were just my opinions. I understand that many enjoyed the rebuild films for reasons I still don't understand, but that doesn't delegitimize set reasons. I'm always looking for new takes on these films, and I've definitely not discussed all I can about them. Although, food for thought, if you need so much explanation on the rebuild films and Evangelion as a whole, what does that say for the series itself and not you as a person? I'll leave that up to you. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you're new. And as I always say, the world is not a dark place, and tomorrow will be a good day. Thanks for watching.